Good evening. This evening, more than an introduction, my comments might be better thought of as a prologue to a 3-day journey led by Dr. Walter Brueggemann. A journey which begins this evening and ends with our service on Sunday, as Bob pointed out. Like all worthwhile journeys, there will be new territories to explore, perhaps some old ones to revisit with fresh eyes and ears, perhaps some risks, and dare I say at the beginning of the journey, there might even be a little fatigue. The fatigue that comes from listening hard and sometimes feeling overrun with new ideas and challenges. And quite frankly, at a more prosaic level, the fatigue which comes from sitting on hard pews. I won't walk you through the traditional litany of our guests' achievements and honors. So numerous are they that to do so would encroach on his time. You will have to do with the very succinct summary in the handout that you came in with, or you can Google works. Suffice it to say that our guest is a very accomplished scholar, well-rooted in the Old Testament, living in both, and a man who has shown repeatedly through his works a willingness to challenge received wisdom. And to top it off, one of his books, a collection of prayers titled Ode to Heaven, Rooted in Earth, is in my mind, and I hope you agree, as much poetry as prayer. And as you will hear in this prayer poem, which caught my eye and then my ear as I read it aloud. So to get some measure of our guest in his own words is Walter's prayer poem, Not the God We Would Have Chosen. We would as soon you were stable and reliable. We would as soon that you were predictable and always the same toward us. We would like to take the hammer of doctrine and take the nails of piety and nail your feet to the floor and have you stay in one place. And then we find you moving, always surprising us, always coming at us from new directions, always planting us, always uprooting us, and tearing all things down and making all things new. You're not the God that we would have chosen had we done the choosing. But we are your people, and you have chosen us in freedom. We pray for the great gift of freedom that we may be free toward you as you are toward the world. Give us that gift of freedom that we may move in new places in obedience and in gratitude. Thank you for Jesus, who embodied your freedom for all of us. Amen. So on that prayerful and poetic note, I give you Dr. Brueggemann, who this evening launches us on our way with the first lecture, The Hard Road from Obedience to Praise. Walter.
Thank you. Thank you. How's that?
Well,
Oh, okay.
you're double rated.
Good. Well, I'm delighted to get to be with you tonight. I have never been to your city before, and what a lovely, lovely place. I wish that I had could just continue listening to the piano till the evening was over, and then go out and enjoy the wonder. And I am glad to be in this distinguished lectureship that's been going on these 18 years, and I am glad that my turn came to do that. Your rector and I have become fast pen pals. We have a sheaf of correspondence like that, so it's nice to all come to fruition. I'm going to talk about the Psalms. I thought probably talking to Anglicans about the book of Psalms is like carrying coals to Newcastle. But as near as I can tell, almost none of you have your Bible with you. So if you return tomorrow, bring your Bible or your Book of Common Prayer that has the Psalms in it. If you do not own a Bible, check into a motel somewhere and steal one. The Book of Psalms has, from the beginning of the church, been the main script for spirituality. Martin Luther said that the Psalms are the gospel in nuce, in a nutshell, and it is not so widely known that Luther came to his great Reformation insight about the grace of God when he was lecturing on the Psalms. I had always thought it was the book of Romans, but it was the Psalms. And John Calvin has famously written that the Psalms are the anatomy of the soul. So if you want to study human nature and human personality, you take Anatomy 101 and you study the Psalms. And Kathleen Norris more recently has written that the wonderful thing about the book of Psalms is that God is permitted to do many things in the book of Psalms that God would not otherwise do or be permitted to do. So I want to talk about the dialogical force of the book of Psalms, this intense engagement between Israel and God, or between the church and God, or between the world and God, or between the believer and God, because I believe in the contemporary world, for the church to be able to practice serious dialogical transactions is enormously important. We tend to fall out of dialogue either on the side of authoritarianism, in which we become submissive and deferential, or we fall out on the side of autonomy, like nobody's going to tell us what to do and I'll do what I want to, thank you. But against authoritarianism and against autonomy, to sustain a dialogue that requires the best of both parties and that puts both parties at risk requires great intentionality. And so I want for these three presentations to be doing a reading of the book of Psalms and to think with you about this script of dialogue that is perhaps the oldest script in the church. As you may know about the book of Psalms, there are lots of praise hymns. Those are the ones we know best, and those are the ones we like best. As you likely also know, there are 1/3 of the book of Psalms are laments and complaints and protests. These are the Psalms that we tend to skip over. I like to say when I'm not with Anglicans that the Anglicans are the only ones that have preserved the serious use of the Psalter, but then I quickly say, but the Anglicans tend to set the Psalter to such nice music that nobody notices what's being said. So in much of the church, what you tend to get are snippets of the Psalm. So if you have a responsorial reading, you may get 3 lines of the Psalm that you just keep repeating and stuff like that. So I am interested in thinking with you about what would happen in the church if we really took seriously the plot and the dialogical continuity that you read from psalm to psalm to psalm. So the way I want to organize this is to say that if you take the first psalm, it begins in obedience. I'll come back to that. And the last psalm is this outrageous hymn of praise. So I am interested in how do you get from Psalm 1 to Psalm 150. And my little scheme for that is to say that there are psalms of orientation, there are psalms of disorientation, and there are psalms of new orientation. It worked out well since I got asked to do 3 presentations, that's the way I'm going to work it. Now you can see what I mean by orientation. I mean everything's working. Everything's good, and God is good all the time. All the time, God is good. And there are seasons like that in our life. But there are also seasons in our life of disorientation. In the Old Testament, the big disorientation is the destruction of Jerusalem at the hands of the Babylonians, and you can argue that Jews really never got over that. In the New Testament, the big disorientation is the crucifixion of Jesus on Friday. In the modern world, one might think that the big disorientation is the Jewish Holocaust, and maybe we'll never get over that, or many other genocides. But disorientation happens more intimately and personally. It happens in a failed marriage, it happens in an unwanted pregnancy, it happens in a cancer diagnosis, it happens in all kinds of ways in which our capacity to hold it together fails. And I don't know how it is in Canada, but south of the border, when things like that happen to people, they tend to disappear from the church. And people kind of factor out that the church is for nice, happy people. And I might get back to it later, but I got to drop out and deal with my stuff. And new orientation is the surprise of healing and transformation and new waves of goodness that make it possible to reorient and reorganize one's life. So that's kind of how I want to track this. I want to suggest that the living of a full human life consists in making the move from orientation into disorientation, and from making the move from disorientation into new orientation. And what begins to happen then is that the new orientation becomes jaded and becomes the old orientation, and then the process continues. But I believe that the making of these 2 moves into disorientation or into new orientation characteristically is a hard move that we do not want to make. We do not want to move into disorientation, and we spend a lot of energy pretending that it is not so, or engaged in denial. And pastors and priests experience that. If you say to somebody, "How are things going?" and they say, "Fine, everything is just fine," and you suspect that it's not. But it's also the case, I think, that we often do not want to make the move into new orientation, because that means moving out in new directions. It means taking responsibility. It means giving up the pathologies and the disorders that we have learned to work to our advantage. And so I suggest that the book of Psalms is the practice of this community of Israel and then the church kind of a script and a guideline for moving into disorientation and then moving into new orientation. Sigmund Freud's great insight as a Jew is that you make those moves by saying it out loud. There's something very Jewish. You've heard it said that if you have 10 Jews, you'll have 11 opinions. In the history of philosophy, the Greek tradition is for people who think and reason, but the Jewish tradition is for people who talk and who argue and who dispute. And Freud's great insight that led to the whole practice of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis is that talk in the face of someone whom you trust is a transformative proposition. And so I want to suggest that ancient Israel had understood that at the beginning of the Jewish tradition, long before Freud came along late and capitalized on that great insight. In the Jewish tradition, the move from orientation to disorientation is the readiness to move into suffering in the conviction that suffering is meaningful. It is a precious treasure of biblical faith that suffering is not simply to be avoided, but suffering becomes a place where one may find meaning and may find God. And in the Jewish tradition, the move into new orientation is an act of hope. And hope is a Jewish gift to the world. There is no hope in the Greek tradition. So both suffering and hope are peculiar gifts that we Christians take from Jews and we read out of the Old Testament. In the New Testament tradition, the move into disorientation is the crucifixion of Jesus, which, as you know, Jesus recited Psalm 22 on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? And in the Christian tradition, the move into new orientation is Easter, when the priest says Christ is risen and the congregation says he is risen indeed. And liturgically, we need to be claiming that the world is at a new place. So I want to think about those two moves. And if you think about the Jewish moves and the Christian moves, it occurs to me that this same movement is really the structure of Christian baptism. And many of our traditions now only sprinkle with just a little bit of water, but in fact, baptism really is immersion. It means going into the waters of chaos, into disorientation, and coming out with a new identity. So we say at baptism that we die with Christ and we are raised to new life. So even the very structure of baptism is the enactment of this same sequence in two moves. So I want to suggest that the Christian tradition derived from the Psalms and derived from the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus is a quite remarkable practice and a quite remarkable understanding of life, because people outside of this tradition want to imagine that life can be lived smoothly without disruption, and that requires a great deal of denial to carry on one's life that way. So that is what I want to unpack with you. Now tonight, I'm going to talk about the Psalms of orientation. These are the Psalms that we know best. I'm sorry to take your Friday evening with them because they're not very interesting psalms. They're not very interesting psalms because nothing happens. And people whose lives are well-oriented do not want anything to happen. So it is, these are really psalms of maintenance, and I'm going to mention a number of these, and then I'm going to draw some conclusions from that. It's proper to begin with Psalm 1, which is, in my labeling, a psalm of orientation. Probably Psalm 1 was put at the beginning of the Psalter by the hymnal committee. You know, all of our church hymnals have a foreword that was put there by the hymnal committee telling you how to read, how to use the hymnal. We never read those, but hymnal committees take that very seriously. And so probably Psalm 1 is that way, and you probably, even if you do not know many Psalms, you probably know Psalm 1, which starts out by saying blessed or happy or lucky. Lucky is the person. So this is a guideline for how to make your world work. Lucky are people who do not sit in the councils of the ungodly, who do not have bad friends, who do not associate with the wrong kind of people, but who meditate on the Torah day and night. That's why we got it up there. We meditate on the Torah day and night. Now, probably in the book of Psalms, when you come across the word Torah, which we translate law, it probably refers to the book of Deuteronomy. That probably is the Torah that they have in mind. And as you may know, the book of Deuteronomy is particularly a meditation on social justice, on care for widows and orphans and sojourners and immigrants. So the recipe for a happy life is to think all the time about God's will for justice. And then the psalm goes on to say that people who spend their time thinking about God's will for justice rather than associate with trivial people, and you remember that the Bible is in a very arid climate, people to do that will be like willow trees that are planted by springs of water, and they will flourish and be leafy and give shade and prosper. But the contrast are the wicked, the ones who are not with the program, and they will be like chaff that comes out of the back of a combine and it blows away and it leaves no forwarding address. And the last verse of the psalm says that the righteous who keep the Torah will prosper, but the way of the wicked will be excluded and will perish. Now that's pretty naive. It's pretty simplistic. And if you lived a while, you might suspect that it doesn't work that way. But it is what we teach our children. We do teach our young children that if you stay with the program, you'll get to do the things you want to do. And if you don't stay with the program, you might be grounded or disciplined or punished or one of those neat things. So Psalm 1 is an invitation to read the Psalter as though it were a clue for living a life without problem or without trouble. As you may know, the longest psalm is Psalm 119, and you can't tell this in English, but the reason it's so long is that the first 8 verses begin with the Aleph of the Hebrew alphabet, and the second 8 verses begin with the B of the Hebrew alphabet, and it goes all through the alphabet, and the Hebrew alphabet has 22 letters, So if you multiply 22 times 8, you'll get the number of verses that are in that psalm. Can you imagine writing a psalm like that? I don't know, some of you are old. I guess these love ballads were available in Canada too. Do any of you remember the song that went through the alphabet? A, you're adorable. B, you're so beautiful. C, you're a cutie full of charms. D, you're a darling. And E, you're exciting. And F, you're a feather in my arms. And so on. That's what they're doing. They are laying out the rules for a well-ordered life. And if you practice all these guidelines, you will be blessed every day of your life. A second psalm of orientation that I will mention is Psalm 104, which is a creation psalm. It's the best creation song that we have in the Old Testament, and I think it is so long because it wants you to notice the wonderful fabric of creation and the design and the way it works. And what you have when you get done with Psalm 104, you have a perfectly ordered, wonderfully reliable creation. It begins with the earth and the sky and the water, and then it has a section in which it talks about springs of water that gush down the valleys, giving grass for the cattle. And you know, when you think about before we got to all this global warming, it was simply amazing that the water came up out of the earth and it evaporated and it went into the ocean and it made the cycle again and it went over. They got all that. And then it says, this is most remarkable, that because there's such good water and fertility and richness, that the earth produces water and wine and bread and oil. These are all the sacramental tools that make life significant and meaningful, and they are gifts of creation, which is why in the Anglican Eucharist the elements for the Eucharist are brought forward by the people from the land and from the produce of the earth, because it's the stuff of the earth that signifies God's goodness. And then it says that the world is perfectly ordered so that human persons work all day and sleep all night, and lions sleep all day and work all night, and they don't get in each other's way. And if you move on through, there's a little table prayer that says, the eyes of all look to you in due season, and you open your hand and everybody gets food. The food chain works. And near the end of the psalm, God is portrayed as a great, reliable iron lung. And when God gives breath, the world lives. And God has been doing that forever. And the verse in front of that says that if God withholds his breath, the world will die. He's got the whole world in his hands. It's so wonderful. But I want you not to miss verse 35. It's a kind of a surprise, and most churches, if they do this psalm at all, they leave out verse 35. Because it says, but the way of the wicked shall perish, and the unrighteous will be swept away. Which means, doesn't it, that the world works because people keep the Torah. And if there are people that do not keep the Torah, They will damage the earth. So Psalms of orientation have a kind of a bite to them that you better get with the program, because the program is what makes it work. Another psalm, there are a lot of genre of these psalms. In Psalm 15, scholars call this an entrance psalm. It begins with a question that presumably the priest asked outside the church building. And the priest says, who will ascend into the hill of the Lord? Who will enter into the tabernacles of God? That is, who are we going to let into church? And then the congregation says, those who have clean hands and pure hearts, who do not lift up their mouths to deceitfulness, who do not slander, who do not take bribes, who do not associate with bad people, they get to come in. And the last line of the psalm says, they will never be moved. Nothing bad will ever happen to them. So this is a liturgical piece for the people that honor the world and who by their good living keep the world working. There is a parallel psalm in Psalm 24 where the same thing happens. That one begins by saying the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, and all who dwell there. Everything belongs to God. God's the creator. But then the same question is asked, who gets to come in here? And the same answer is given about people who are keeping Torah and being responsible and honorable and caring and all that good stuff. And then Psalm 24 has an additional stanza that is not in 15. 15 is a very short psalm, but Psalm 24 then says, be ye lifted up, ye everlasting doors, and the King of glory will come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord mighty in power. And what scholars imagine that when they said, be ye lifted up, ye everlasting doors, is that they opened the temple doors. And then, like good Anglicans, there was a great procession in which they carried the Ark of the Covenant in, and God sat on top of the Ark and led in all the good people. So 15 and 24 are psalms that connect Torah obedience and liturgical participation so that the liturgy is practiced by the people who keep the world going, by being in sync with God's purposes for the world. I'm going to mention two other psalms that are really quite interesting. One of them is Psalm 37. It's not a psalm that we use a lot, but I want to call your attention to it, and maybe you want to take a look at it sometime. This is a psalm that is a collection of proverbs. It could well have been in the book of Proverbs, but you'll get the hang of what I want you to see. In verse 3, these are the psalms of people for whom the world is working. Trust in the Lord and do good, so you will live in the land. That makes sense. You can imagine an agricultural community that you got to do these things if you don't want your farm to go to pot. Verse 9, the wicked, that's the ones that don't do this, the wicked shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. Verse 11, the meek shall inherit the land. That's the statement about that Jesus quotes, the meek shall inherit the earth. J. Paul Getty, you may know, famously said that the meek shall inherit the earth, but it doesn't say anything about mineral rights. So that's, how's this for subprime loans? The wicked borrow, verse 21, the wicked borrow and do not pay back, but the righteous are generous and keep giving. For those blessed by the Lord shall inherit the land. The children of the wicked, verse 28, the children of the wicked shall be cut off, but the righteous shall inherit the land. Verse 34, wait for the Lord, and he will exalt you to inherit the land. What you see all through this long psalm is that the Torah is a way to get the land and to keep the land. And you can make the case that global warming is a systemic practice of wickedness. We wouldn't label it that, but it is in biblical rhetoric, and it's a way to lose the land. Now, there's one other verse here that is really peculiar. The guy that's doing this psalm says, you can just see some old man giving advice to his grandchildren. I have been young, and now I'm old. I lived a long time. I've been watching a lot. And I have never seen the righteous forsaken, and I have never seen the children of the righteous begging for bread. This is a confirmation of Psalm 1. All my observations are people who do Psalm 1 and keep the Torah, everything works for them. Now, my response to that is that this guy that wrote this psalm must have led a very sheltered life if he never saw any righteous, responsible people reduced to trouble. But you see how this psalm works in popular morality. And I don't know whether you have any poor people in Canada, but the word in the United States, if somebody's poor, I guess they're lazy. If they'd have worked like me, that wouldn't be happening to them. The last psalm that I'll mention is Psalm 46. This is one that you know very well. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble. Therefore, though the earth totter and fall apart, we will not fear. For the God of Jacob is with us, the Lord of hosts is our refuge. Some scholars think that this psalm was written in the Jerusalem temple after 701, when the city of Jerusalem was miraculously delivered from the Assyrians, and they came to the conviction that God would always keep Jerusalem safe. So God is our refuge. There is a city whose streams make glad. There is a city whose streams make glad the God of our fathers, referring to Jerusalem. Now you can see how problematic that psalm was if it was written in around 701, because 100 years later, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, it turned out not to be true. You may also know that Martin Luther wrote his famous hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," that is derived from Psalm 46. So what a mighty fortress, what that hymn is about, is that everything else may fail, but you can count on God to keep us safe and keep the world working. Psalm 46 is called a Song of Zion. There are half a dozen psalms that celebrate the wonder of Jerusalem and the wonder of the Jerusalem temple. So you know Psalm 84, how lovely are thy dwelling places, and Brahms took that one up and all of that. Or I was glad when they said to me, 122, let us go into the house of the Lord, and it was wonderful to get to go to Jerusalem. When 9/11 happened at my seminary in Atlanta, We had endless worship services. Students were so upset. We were all upset. And these worship services were planned by many different groups in the seminary. They didn't consult with each other, but every one of them used Psalm 46. Psalm 46 was when it felt like our society was disintegrating, so we were led to believe. It felt like Psalm 46 was an anchor that you can count on. Now, that's a spread. There are obviously many others, but these are typical and representative songs of orientation that celebrate the Torah. They celebrate creation. They celebrate right ethics. They celebrate a kind of ethical shrewdness about how to keep the land. They celebrate God's commitment to the historical institutions of Jerusalem. All of these psalms are statements of enormous confidence that the way the world is, the world will hold. And you could argue that lots of people come to church when their lives may be frayed, come to church to reenact that conviction again. Have you got a word for the Lord that God is good? So I want to suggest to you 6 theological conclusions that I draw from this, 3 positive and 3 negative. So the 3 positive. First of all, that the Psalms of orientation celebrate the life-giving capacity of God's creation. While Psalm 104 is the most direct statement, that there are lots of hints about that. I didn't mention, for example, Psalm 8. O Lord, what is Adam? It's a direct reference to Genesis 1. What is Adam? What is man? That thou art mindful of him, or the Son of Man, that thou visit him. Yet thou hast made Adam little lower than the angels, and given him dominion over all of the earth. So Psalm 8 is a familiar celebration of creation, and Israel has enormous conviction that God has made the world stable and reliable. The second conviction that is closely related to that is that the world is ordered so that you can fall back into an order that will keep you safe and give you well-being. But I want to suggest that these Psalms not only celebrate the order of the world, but that the recital of these Psalms also serve to maintain the order of the world, so that the church's use of the psalm is a performance that constructs the world. This is why people love to, and I now worship in an Episcopal congregation, and I've noticed that Episcopalians have a lot of unsingable songs. I don't know whether you do here, but people love to come to church and sing the old familiar songs, because the singing of those psalms helps construct and maintain a sense of reliable belonging. And you feel different when you have done that a while in church, and then you go home kind of reinforced. Third, positive. The Psalms of retribution that come right out of the book of Deuteronomy, that is, you do bad things, you'll get bad things, you do good things, you'll get good things, are a conviction in the Bible that the world is morally coherent and that things are connected. A simple way of putting that is, what you sow, you'll reap. And you can't break that. You can break that for a while, but it'll come back on you. So blessed is the guy who honors the Torah, because that's what will come from it. I don't know how closely some of you who are older followed the rise and fall of Richard Nixon in the United States, but one of the things that Richard Nixon started doing in his last year or so of his presidency, when they would call him on things, his press secretary simply announced, that's no longer operable. We're not, that doesn't count anymore. So, you know, there are a lot of things you wish weren't operable. If you have a careless moment of sex, you might wish the next day that were not operable. Or even if you say something careless that hurts somebody, you wish you could take it, but you can't take it back. It's out there, and it's connected with consequences. So the book of Deuteronomy and the book of Psalms express a conviction that human actions have moral significance. That's a favorite accent of ethical teaching in the church. It matters how you live. It matters what you do, because every time you make a decision, you're choosing a future. And what we now know is every time you make a decision, you're not only choosing a future for yourself, but you're choosing a future for your neighbors. So the neighbors care about what you do. All of that is in these Psalms. Now the negatives, see if you agree with this. These Psalms, I think, function as a form of social control. They leverage people to cause people to do what we want them to do. I think particularly all good parents exercise social control over their children. Sometimes it turns out to be nagging, but it's all in their best interest. It's all in their interest if they're not embarrassing us, and so on. I think most of us would think that that contract is now much relaxed between parents and children compared to the way it used to be, but I suspect not on the things that are important. There may be different things that are important, but we do want our children to be ethically formed so they reflect the things that have worked for us. And we don't want them to mess it up. So that can get to be heavy-handed, in which you exclude people who are unwilling to stay with the program. And it even happens in families. Fifth, I think that Psalms of orientation are factories for guilt. If something goes wrong in this symmetrical world that is reliable, if something goes wrong, it must be because you messed it up. Because the Psalms of orientation never think that there could be accidental slippage in the world, and they never think that God is unfair. So if God is fair and there's no slippage, you must have failed. And I incline to think that the long preoccupation with guilt in the liturgy of the church and the regular confession of sin and the assurance of pardon sort of tilts the whole calculus of faith in the direction of guilt that I believe is consistent with these kinds of psalms. And the last point I will mention, and then I'll be finished, I believe these psalms are a recipe for denial, in which you have to keep pretending that it's working long after it's not working. So no, I'm not an alcoholic. I just got careless a few times. No, our marriage is not in trouble. We kind of don't talk to each other at all, but, you know, we're going to make this work. And the axe that I want to grind is that in popular piety, without people ever thinking about it, the only psalms people know are the psalms of orientation. So I'm going to talk tomorrow about why it's important to keep the rest of the repertoire working that allows for faith in disorientation. But as long as you don't have psalms like that, as long as you imagine that this is the whole repertoire, as long as you don't imagine there's any way of faith outside this package, then I believe that social control and guilt and denial are likely to be on the program. Obviously, my setup for tonight to get ready to talk tomorrow for those of you that come back is to say that the Psalms of Orientation are enormously valuable resources for us. But they are by themselves not adequate because they do not allow for the slippages of disorientation that are inescapable in the living of one's life. And tomorrow what I want to talk about is why these other psalms provide terribly important resources for us. Now, Bob, we will move right to questions here and see whether you'd like to respond to any of this.
I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the people who wrote the Psalms and the historical circumstances they found themselves in that gave rise to the writing of the Psalms.
Well, first of all, there's a lot we don't know about where these Psalms come from. They're just kind of there. In the United Church of Christ hymnal, that's my church, at the bottom of every page, they now have added 3 lines telling who wrote the psalm and where it came from. And you can tell the hymnal was put together by elite people because they love it if they can find a hymn writer who went to Harvard or Yale. But what's interesting is that when they get to, we have about 8 Negro spirituals, and they don't say anything. Nobody knows where Negro spirituals came from. They just were there. The usual hypothesis is that in the late period of the Old Testament, we know from the book of 2nd Chronicles that there were in the second temple after the exile, there were temple guilds of singers and choir masters that were on the temple payroll, and you can see that there are some psalms in the 70s and 80s. It says a psalm of Asaph or a psalm of Korah. Those are the 2 that recur. They have about a dozen apiece. So the assumption is that the people gathered around some figure named Korah worked in the temple, and they either wrote these psalms or they gathered these psalms, and so with Asaph as well. But they may have been only collectors, and the psalms themselves sort of come from everywhere. I should mention that there are probably a dozen psalms that are related to the life of King David. For example, Psalm 51, that's the one we use on, Ash Wednesday? Is that when you use that? Against thee and thee only have I sinned, and in sin did my mother conceive me. And the line says, a psalm of David after he had gone into Bathsheba. Now, most critical scholars would say those superscriptions, that's what they're called, are not historically reliable. They are probably late additions given by these temple singers to tell us how we are to think about this psalm and so on. But Israel certainly borrowed psalms from other cultures, the way some of our Christmas carols are borrowed from secular songs and so on. So it's a kind of a mishmash about that. Yeah. And I would assume, like our hymnals, what hymnal committees finally do when they select what the church is going to be, what's going to be in the book for the church, they have to be guided by what the church is willing to sing. And they know there are certain songs you cannot leave out. And then every time they do the hymnal, they'll slip in 12 new ones that nobody ever uses. And I suspect that what the Psalter, though we don't know this, it probably reflects what in fact was used. It also is the case that probably the book of Psalms is made up of smaller collections. So I could imagine sometime we'll get an ecumenical hymnal, and we'll have 30 hymns that the Episcopalians have to have, and 40 that the Presbyterians have to have, and so that may well be that the Psalter is an ecumenical document reflecting all the different sects and parties in Israel, but there's a lot we don't know. Yeah. There you go.
Were most of the Psalms post-exilic?
Certainly many of them are. Many of them are in dispute, and scholars argue about that. But I suspect most scholars now would say more of them are post-exilic than early. Yeah. Right.
Thank you.
And it figures that the great crisis of the exile would have evoked all this new singing. Yeah, right.
Does your typology assume anything in particular about the social location? I mean, surely the fact that a psalm would be a psalm of orientation depends on where you are in the great scheme of things.
That's right.
And so I wonder how to use the typology you're proposing in a so-called postmodern context.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, if you do the post-exilic thing from the book of Chronicles that I just said, what scholars would say is that the temple singer guilds were what scholars are now calling the urban elite. There were limits on what they could do. They couldn't ignore other people, but there is no doubt that songs of orientation do reflect the vested interests of the powerful, who sing these songs not only to celebrate their power, but as a way of keeping their power. There's no doubt that much of the church's hymnody does the same thing. I've done sabbaticals in Cambridge and went as often as I could to King's College Evensong. But what you notice in that Evensong service, is that in 45 minutes in King Henry's chapel, the choir says, "As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end." Now, why would they say that? Well, because Henry's throne is a world without end. And, so I don't think any of these usages are innocent. There's not a complete correlation of power and faith, but there's not a disconnect either. So the African American church will have many more slow, sad songs because of their social location than Trinity Wall Street, that used to be the meeting of the bankers, and so on. There's a lot we don't know about that, but we do know a good bit about the urban elites. There's a little bit of irony in current scholarship because critical scholars now love to beat up on the urban elites in the Old Testament, not recognizing that all of us who are tenured academics are all urban elites. So, I guess it takes one to know one, or something like that. If it is true that these are the people that put the Psalter together, then the astonishing thing is that these other voices that I'm going to talk tomorrow got in there at all. And I suppose it's like in the United Church of Christ hymnal, you cannot leave out 12 Negro spirituals, because we got a lot of black members and they're going to look for their songs, and maybe that. So it's all very enigmatic. You want to say more? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to wait till tomorrow to say this, but I can't be here tomorrow, and it does fit in with the people who wrote the Psalms. I've been struck for a long time by the fact that at least 50% of the Psalms mention or are real concerned with enemies, both public and private, and our hymnal doesn't do that.
I'm sorry?
Our hymnal doesn't have that kind of thing. Who are these people, and why were they concerned so much about enemies?
Yeah. Well, they probably were paranoid. But you know the saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. So, well, on the one hand, the enemies could be foreigners, as in Psalm 137 with the Babylonians, but more likely they are communal disputes in the late Persian period, because Judaism was in a battle to determine what's the real Judaism. And the righteous are the zealous Torah keepers, and the people that are not like us are wicked. Now, I gather that the Anglican Church in Canada, not so much so, but in the Episcopal Church in the United States, around the whole question of same-sex marriage, you can identify the righteous and the wicked and all that. So it's not hard to understand that. I mean, whoever the other one is, that's, yeah. So I think it probably had to do with conflicting notions of what constituted Torah obedience. And the ones that obey the Torah the way we think it ought to be obeyed are the righteous. If you think of Leviticus and Deuteronomy as two great interpretive programs, by and large, the book of Deuteronomy is about justice, We now call those people liberals. And by and large, the book of Leviticus is about purity, which in some ways, that's what we do by conservatives. And these two parties continue to have a go at who the real Jews are. I think that must be the context in which most of this happens. And one scholar has pointed to 6 uses of what he says is a technical phrase for evildoers. And his proposal is that evildoers in this pre-scientific world were people who had powerful words who put the hex on you. So if somebody put the hex on you, you go to church and you ask God to get them so that the hex doesn't destroy, like that. So, you may say that there's some element of superstition or magic in all this, but there is in most religions. So, do you want to come back at that at all? Good? Yep.
Does the image of God change as you go from one phase to another?
From one what?
Does the image of God change as you go from orientation to disorientation to new orientation?
I think so. I think king and judge are the images of God for the rule keeper who keeps everything working. But when you get down and dirty in disorientation, you need a savior, you need a partner. So you get a metaphor of shepherd or of a gardener who takes care of my vineyard. See, I believe you get a richer array of metaphors. If you're trying to learn Hebrew, as I'm always trying to do, reading the Psalms of orientation is pretty simple Hebrew. It's a limited vocabulary. But when you get into the Laments, it's a rich vocabulary. It's like being in psychotherapy and you say all kinds of things that you wouldn't think to say anywhere else. And they're dealing with the God from whom no secret can be hid. And I haven't worked that out systematically, but I do know it's a richer vocabulary, and I think you would get a much fuller array of images for God. Yeah, it's good.
How does this typology of function tie in with the shape of the editorial shape of the Psalter?
As you may know, there's now great discussion about the shape of the Psalter. You see, what we have basically done liturgically, we've just taken one psalm and one psalm and one psalm, and you get it in the lectionary or whatever. Scholars are now thinking about the fact that the way the psalms are arranged back to back is also making an interpretive judgment. And we're not, it's very complex and we're not very far along with this, but what I would say is that the laments by and large occur in the first half of the book. And as you move after Psalm 90, for example, let's see, Psalm 90 begins the third, the book of Psalms is divided into 5 books. When you get to the third book, by and large you have hymns and celebration. Now, whether that means anything, I don't know. If it means something, I can understand that. I can understand that you weep through the night, as the psalmist says, and joy comes in the morning. So when you get contentious and conflicted, if you process that, you will arrive, maybe, at a good place where you can give God thanks and praise. Now, whether the book of Psalms is in fact arranged that way, I don't know. But that would be a way of thinking about it, I think. Yep.
I just wanted to ask you a question. I can understand why rich and powerful people would like the simplest, that all is well, and the orientation Psalms are simple, but don't you have to start somewhere? I mean, don't you have to begin with creation and God's goodness before you even go away from it? I mean, there was a time before the fall.
Yeah. You could.
I mean, it's not just, they weren't just there so that, the poor were.
Well, let me respond and see if I get your question. Presumably, the people that make the Psalms, they had the whole narrative tradition behind them, so they knew that.
Right.
But you wouldn't have to start with creation. You could start with my 82-year-old neighbor who's got pain in his eye that he can't get rid of so that he can't sleep. That is, you could start with your own pain, or you could start with your neighbor's pain and go from there.
But wouldn't you start with God first? Or do you start,
Not if you're hurt badly enough.
No, it's true.
I think that if one is in profound pain or hurt or loss, starting with God might be a luxury you can't afford. John Calvin, when he wrote his Institutes, starts out in the first chapter by saying you could start either way. You could start with God and go to man, he called it, or you could start with man and go to God. But then Calvin said, but I'm going to start with God. Now, maybe Calvin understood the tradition and intuited that's really what you have to do. So I wouldn't quibble with starting there. What I would wonder about is staying there too long. It depends on, well, you've already said it, it depends on whether you want to start with the great context of faith or whether you want to face the existential question. And I think that there are pastoral occasions when the existential crisis is so acute that I don't have time for that. Now, let me give you one other example. I think of this often. I believe that prayers of orientation can afford to be decorative. We come to you, O Lord, who has given us the day and the night and the flowers and the moon and the stars, and we thank you for watching, blah, 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 blah. Whereas the prayer in pain is, help!
Okay, but as a Christian educator, if you're teaching children, where would you start?
Depends on the child, doesn't it? If you got a child whose dog just died, you got to start with the dog. Now, you may want to say the dog has gone to be with God, but you got to start with the dog. But then you're a Christian educator, I'm not, so I'd take your wisdom. But I think that when we are in disorientation, the most urgent, desperate yearning we have is to have somebody notice it. Then you can go anywhere with it. But until you notice that, yeah, you're talking like I'm not in the room.
Except there has to be a basis, like a place to go to.
The basis.
I mean, if you're in pain, don't you have to feel that you can go to God? I mean,
the first basis is, if I'm a child who's lost my dog, the first basis is I look into your eyes and I can see that you are taking me seriously. Now, you may be God's agent and God's representative, and you may have many good evangelical truths to say to me. But the first thing I got to see is your face and whether you are turned toward me. The formula that I use, and you may not agree with that. That's okay. We don't have to agree. You see, the Psalms of Orientation assume God is God and I am God's servant. What I propose that has not won a great following, so I'm ready for this, is that in the disorientation, you get a role reversal. You get a role reversal in which the hurt speaker prays imperatives to God. Now, the role reversal is temporary. I know finally God is God. But right now, my back hurts.
I don't want you to take care of that.
That's right.
Right. But you don't say that. I mean, there is...
No, all I'm saying is where you have to start.
Right.
Yeah. And many of those lament psalms do start that way. My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, you want to say it starts with God. No, I'm not starting with God. I am accusing God for not being God. And the reason I can tell you're not God right now is that I'm abandoned. That's what I think. I suspect we don't disagree, but we might cube it.
Are all the Psalms equally inspired?
Equally what?
By God.
What's the word?
Are all the Psalms inspired by God?
Oh, inspired by God. Well, it's a very slippery category. I would say that that Israel found all the Psalms vehicles for truth-telling in some circumstance. Therefore, they must be inspired. But I don't want to say that first. Because if you say that first, it just kind of covers it over.
It struck me that as you were talking about the two transitional stages, and then the use of the Psalms in our current Western liturgy, I'm wondering if observing the church who's turning itself inside out to reinvent itself from a contentment or an orientation, if we're not now in a transition towards total disorientation. This battery is doing so. Nope. All right, thank you. And I'm wondering if that might change our hymnody.
Might change our hymnody?
Yes. I'll just throw that out to you.
I think one of the problems is that we don't have very good music for the Psalms of disorientation. Even if you do a kind of a responsorial thing with a one-line response, it's so nice. I can remember as a child, I grew up in a rural church with a bad choir. But I can remember about every other year the choir would sing Psalm 137. And in all innocence they'd say, dash their heads, dash their heads, dash their heads against the rocks. And I don't know much about music, but it seems to me that the music for those kind of psalms has to be dissonant. And I think maybe we have to learn that from Jews. Jews have that kind of music.
There's also the blues.
That's right. That's right. That's right. I think, I think changing the liturgy is like turning an ocean liner around. But the recovery of these modes of discourse in the life of the church would not only change our liturgy, it would change our theology. and the church that I know, which isn't your church, the church that I know is in danger of becoming as irrelevant as the Republican Party, in which the Republican Party in the United States is just not aware of any problems. And so the church is tempted to become this little insulated community that isn't connected. I mean, everybody in the church knows better than that, but our liturgical practices tend to contain us about that. And so I think we have a lot of work to do, yeah.
You spoke about are they all liturgical in purpose or function?
No, it is disputed, but many interpreters think that the individual lament psalms are more intimate than liturgical. One scholar has proposed, with a lot of evidence he mobilizes, kind of house liturgies in which designated trusted people in the community, and he calls them rehabilitation liturgies. You go to a home that's had great loss, and it's a little bit less than liturgy, but it is a stylized form of processing that stuff. There's just so much we don't know about all that, but one has to imagine many different venues, I would think. Yeah, right.
I think that's
Okay,
about 9 o'clock. Thank you very much,
Yeah.
Dr. Brueggemann.